to today's Bite of Science webinar presented by the Teacher Enrichment Program of the Center for Excellence in Education. My name is Shannon Tyler, and I'm the Teacher Enrichment Program Manager. I will be hosting today's webinar titled Inspiring the Next Generation of Neuroscientists. We are joined by a fantastic speaker today, Dr. Ashley Juavinett from University of California, San Diego. I'm really looking forward to her talk, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Before we jump into the presentation, I'm going to share some brief background information on the Center for Excellence in Education, which was founded in 1983 by Joanne DeGennaro and Admiral Rickover, father of the nuclear navy and civilian uses of nuclear power. Its mission is to nurture high school and university scholars to careers of excellence and leadership in STEM. We have cost-free programs for teachers and students, including the Research Science Institute, USA Biolympiad, the Teacher Enrichment Program, and STEM Lyceums. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these programs on the next slides. So first, we have the Research Science Institute, or RSI, which is a highly competitive 6-week summer science and engineering program open to rising high school seniors, so juniors are eligible to apply. RSI is the first cost-free summer science and engineering program that combines on-campus coursework in scientific theory with off-campus work in science and technology research. Next, we have the USA Biolympiad, or USABO, which is the premier biology competition for high school students in the United States. It provides the motivation, curricular resources, and skills training to take them beyond their classroom experience to the level of international competitiveness. A fun fact about the USABO is that since CEE began administering the USBAO in 2003, every member of the USA Biolympiad team has medaled at the International Biology Olympiad. Next, we have the Teacher Enrichment Program, or TEP, which is the program bringing this webinar to you all today. TEP provides opportunities for middle and high school teachers to connect with leading experts from industry and academia, explore cutting-edge research and development, and make meaningful professional links with direct benefits for you and your students. Last but not least, we have a new initiative at CE, STEM Lyceums. STEM Lyceums is a virtual club for high school students to meet once a month to learn about STEM career pathways from leading field experts. Industry professionals share cutting-edge research and offer unique learning experiences like scholarships and internship opportunities for high achievers. To learn more about our programs and opportunities, please visit our website at www.ce.org. Now, I am very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ashley Juavinett. Dr. Juavinett is a neuroscientist, educator, and author currently working as an associate teaching professor in neurobiology at UC San Diego. She holds a PhD in visual and systems neuroscience and is now focused on developing best practices for training the next generation. In addition to teaching neurobiology and programming courses, Ashley is a columnist at The Transmitter and the author of So You Want to Be a Neuroscientist, a guide to the field for aspiring scientists. Ashley's education research focuses on the emerging intersections of biology and computing. So thank you again for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful, learning just now and before the talk about this organization. It's awesome. I have a particular fondness for high school teaching as well. Actually, one of my first teaching experiences was in high school. So yeah, it's a whole fun thing, and it's great. And I have so much respect for you all. So yeah, today I'm gonna talk about inspiring the next generation of neuroscientists. And I often title my talks "How should we train the next generation?" But I actually really liked inspire as a big piece of this. So today we'll call it "How do we inspire the next generation of neuroscientists?" So I want to start though by maybe trying to inspire you all just briefly in case you're not like me and you're not thinking about the brain all the time, which is to say that, the brain has 86 billion neurons, and this is on the same order of magnitude as how many stars are in the Milky Way, right? And so, when we think about the problem of solving the brain and trying to make sense of what all of those individual cells in the brain are doing, this is a tremendous problem, right? This is a problem like I think of our lifetimes trying to understand what all those different cells are doing, how things go awry in different kinds of neurological conditions. It's a big, big problem that we have to try to inspire students who want to solve. So today I'm going to break this sort of question down into some inputs and outputs. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, what even is neuroscience and maybe where it's heading, because that really changes the way we think about bringing our students into the fold. So when I ask my students what neuroscience is, they tell me any number of things. And here's a word cloud that shows you the main words that they give me. And they say, it's a study of neurons and behavior, physiology. Maybe they think about the fact that it has some intersections with psychology or cognitive science. But the thing is, neuroscience is a lot of different things. I'd like to paint a picture of neuroscience in terms of where it was 100 years ago and where it's going now into the 21st century. So, if we look back 100 years ago, and this is a study from the 1960s, we were doing things like trying to just understand what single individual cells in the brain were doing. So, this is an experiment where they're actually recording from cells in the brain, and I'm not sure if you can hear the audio here. Yeah, awesome. I wasn't sure if I checked the box again. So what you hear is actually a cell in the brain that is more active at particular moments when this white bar is in the receptive field of those neurons. So those neurons only respond whenever this white bar is there. So we started, at this time trying to understand, okay, maybe there were single cells in the brain, and maybe those single cells do particular things. Like this neuron is in the visual system and it cares about particular features of visual scenes. And this is kind of what we were doing in the 1960s. We were poking and prodding and recording from single neurons at a time, even just listening to them and asking when are they more active or not. These days, neuroscience looks really different. So we can do things like record from thousands of neurons simultaneously. We're doing it in a bunch of different animal models. This is an example here in the top left of a larval zebrafish, where we can actually see every single neuron in this zebrafish's brain while it's thinking its zebrafish thoughts. And then we can ask what is going on in that zebrafish brain. We know that there are many different cell types in the brain, not just neurons and glia, but actually lots of different subtypes of those different neurons and glia. And then finally, we can study the brain in a way that we never have before, which is during behavior. So while animals are actually moving around the world, we can ask, what are all the neurons doing to support this behavior? So we are pretty quickly advancing towards this dream of understanding what single neurons and big groups of neurons are all doing in those big brains that we have here. So, neuroscience is a tricky thing to train students for because it spans a lot of different levels of investigation. So, this is a figure that I like, which is showing us that neuroscience is not just an understanding of neurons, which is the picture I just painted, but actually it's an understanding of the things that build up those neurons, like all of the synapses that are connections between those cells. It's also an exploration of the genetic makeup of our bodies and of our brains. And then at the top of this scale, it's an understanding of behavior and cognition and how we think and learn and make decisions. So the tricky thing about neuroscience is that it spans all of these levels of investigation. So if that's where neuroscience was and kind of what neuroscience covers, we can then ask the question, okay, where is it heading? So I already showed you that the data is getting much bigger. We can do amazing things in terms of recording brain activity. And just to kind of put some more numbers behind this, here's a timeline of what neuroscience has looked like in the past 60 or 70 years, which is we started in the 1960s doing those single neuron, single electrode studies. And now we're recording, as I said, thousands of neurons simultaneously using different technology. This is the plot on the right-hand side showing the publication date of different papers and the simultaneously recorded neurons in those papers. It doesn't even go up to 2025, where it's like even higher now. So basically, every time someone gets a PhD, we double the number of times, or the number of neurons we can actually record. So this is an extremely quick process of learning how to record from new neurons. So neuroscience data, as a result, is getting bigger. So let's say we want to take one mouse brain, which is a common model in neuroscience research, and we want to maybe try to get an idea of how all of the neurons in a mouse brain are talking to one another. So if we assume 1,000 connections for every single neuron in that mouse brain, we'd get a few hundred gigabytes of data, right? So this is probably like as much as your phone can store. Uh, if we want to image those cells at some reasonable resolution, we get 500 petabytes of data, way, way more data. And then if we want to record from every single pixel, then we would also get 500 petabytes of data. So this is beyond the kind of data that like Excel spreadsheets can handle, for example. It's like we're really exceeding the limits of some of our technology. So as a result of this technological innovation and therefore bigger data sets, we need bigger computation and bigger theory to go along with it. So this is a plot from a recent paper that came out showing us sort of similar to before, this different level of investigation, all the way from genes through neurons up to environments and behavior. The kind of data that we typically collect as we're asking questions about those different levels, and then the kind of tools and models that we need to make sense of that data. And the big open question for me as an educator right now is how do we train our students for this, right? This is a whole different level of analysis than we have typically been thinking about in terms of our training. And we need to get students up to speed so that they can actually work with this data and address big questions about the brain. We also need some theoretical frameworks. So this is a picture of a C. elegans worm, which is a really popular model in biology, right? They're about these tiny little worms. And we know and have known for several decades now that they have 302 nerve cells. We actually know all of the connectivity of those different neurons. We have a whole connectome. And we still can't, for example, like rebuild a synthetic worm. So I couldn't like create, we don't have like a fully computational model of a worm that swims and responds to stimuli and does things because we don't really know like what the rules are. We don't have a theoretical framework for how that worm actually works. So even at that small level, we have about as much information as we think we need, but we need theory to actually guide our understanding so that we could try to understand how these systems actually work. So finally, where neuroscience is heading, I think, is that it's becoming more open, collaborative, and democratic. Maybe this is the optimist in me, but there's some really cool examples of big neuroscience collaborations. So especially because neuroscience is across these scales, and because now it requires the kind of techniques that we typically don't like train students for, we're seeing a lot more collaboration across scientists in different disciplines, which I think is really, really neat. The Simon's collaboration on plasticity in the aging brain, as you see on the right-hand side here, is a really cool example of bringing a lot of researchers in to address, in this case, the question of like what happens when the brain ages. Not even when it ages in disease, just like when it gets older. This collaboration brought a bunch of scientists together before they had really done any research, and it asked, okay, what should we do? And it sort of, from the ground up, built up a research project, and that's ongoing right now. So a lot of what I've just talked about was actually summarized in a report that came out in 2014. It was called the Brain 2025 report, and here we are in 2025. And here's what a bunch of neuroscientists working with the NIH Brain Initiative thought needed to happen. They said, we need quantitative neuroscience. We need more collaboration between theorists and experimentalists. And they said, we need an infrastructure for sharing tools. We need actually more sort of open science, more democratic access to those tools. So finally, when I think about where neuroscience is heading, the other thing I hope for as an educator is that it's also more inclusive to trainees who have been historically and are still excluded from the field. And we have to think really carefully about how we make decisions in our training programs to invite all of those students in, especially when we're thinking about things like increasing computational skill sets and things like that. So that's kind of one big input to this question in terms of like, we're thinking about inspiring or training the next generation, we need to know where the field is going and kind of what's going on. So the next question we can ask is, what skills do students need then? So if this is where the field is moving, let's actually look at the workforce and ask, okay, well, what do students need to be able to succeed in that workforce? So the reality is neuroscience is a diverse and growing field, and there's a lot of different career paths. So people that have neuroscience degrees, whether that's a bachelor's degree or a master's or a PhD, They're in a variety of different sectors. They do things like work in biotech, they work in data science, they're science writers or science editors, and a lot of them are at the forefront of policymaking as well. The reality is, too, that less than half of people with neuroscience PhDs actually stay in academia. So, people that are highly trained neuroscientists are going out into the world and doing a number of really interesting things. So, in my book, I interviewed many of these people, and we've done some more in-depth work, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just to give you sort of a sense of like the kinds of careers people are doing, on the right-hand side here, we have people who are in policy. We have people who do machine learning consulting, people who do data science, people who work in clinical psychology, more on the clinical side of things. We have people who run their own research labs and go sort of the traditional academic route. But they're folks that are doing a variety of different things, all with neuroscience degrees. So we did investigate this a little more thoroughly. So a few years ago, I ran a big survey, and basically I wanted to know what people were doing at their jobs. So for people that had neuroscience degrees, and this includes faculty, but also professionals across industry and teaching, data science, et cetera, I asked them essentially three different questions. So I said, of these skills, and I'll show you the skills in a moment, what level of mastery do you need for your job? How often do you use this skill? And how important is this skill in your current job? And this is work that was done with a student at UCSD who has since graduated. So we looked at the data and we said, okay, let's look at first of all, the graduate students and compare those to everybody else, so the faculty and the professionals. And something that was really interesting is that the grad students told us I really needed to design and plan experiments. This is like the top thing I have to do. I also have to synthesize research and I've got to present that research in front of an audience. And those two things actually overlap with professionals too, but professionals told us we're doing a lot more communication. And to me, this was immediately very interesting because when I think about how we train our graduate students, or even as we train our high school students and our undergrads, I wonder how much we emphasize some of these points, like designing experiments and communicating with other scientists or people in the class. So that list came from a whole big list of different skills, and you can see those on the left-hand side here. And we divided these into bench skills, so types of stuff you might do if you're actually physically doing neuroscience experiments, everything from image processing to working with animals. We also asked about coding skills, and as you might have noticed in my research now, this is a big focus, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes. And then we asked about things like management and communication. So, like, do you have to manage a team? Do you have to communicate, mentor other people? And then finally, how much do you need to do scientific writing and synthesis? And we asked this and broke it up by the different kinds of folks that were in our study. So we have people who are in industry science, people who are faculty or data science, and you can see those labels on the x-axis here. So again, we asked three separate sort of questions. So the mastery, how often or frequency, and then how important these things are. And we have this big grid of things here. And this is a lot of data to parse, but something that I think is pretty clear, even if you just squint at this, is that this management and communication block that's on the bottom third here is pretty dark. So it's pretty both used across different career paths here, and it's also important across these different career paths. So a lot of these skills, again, like communicating with other scientists or clients. So we can simplify this kind of complicated grid here and look at it in terms of a bunch of bar plots and break it down into graduate students and then folks that are in academic research, industry research, and non-research on the far right. And a couple of things popped out of me of this like multifaceted data set, which is that you can see coding and data analysis are pretty high, not just in people doing research, but across academia and also for grad students. And then finally, management communication, also really high. So when I think about training our students, again, communication, working with other people, but also coding and data analysis, as we'll come back to in a minute. So finally, we asked an open-ended question just to kind of see, okay, well, here's a list of skills, but what happens if we just ask people what's important? So what has prepared you for your current position? And coding and communication came out on the top here. But also people said things like interdisciplinarity, like I could actually work across disciplines, or persistence, which probably won't surprise any of you, or networking, right? So also things that we think of as being really, really important in terms of persisting and getting ready for your current positions. So from this study, we had a few takeaways. So we thought that graduate students' skill sets were different than those used by professionals, although they were pretty similar to faculty, which makes sense. Faculty are training grad students basically to be sort of in their image of a scientist. I think this emphasizes the point that students need training in these soft skills, or what we might call soft skills. We saw that a lot of neuroscience careers require some degree of coding, and those that do pay more, which is in the paper as well, since we collected salary information from our participants. And so this got me thinking about a couple of things as an educator, and I sort of honed in on this question of coding. And as I looked around at the landscape of neuroscience programs, I found that not that many actually require coding or even offer it as an elective. So on the right-hand side here, this is a pie chart of undergraduate programs. And so at the time of this particular study that came out in 2017, only 6 of 118 institutions that had undergraduate neuroscience majors actually required coding, and 9 included it as an elective. So most of them by far didn't even offer coding. If you look at PhD programs, there's slightly more, but still not really enough. So 15% of neuroscience PhD programs require coding, and about half at least offer it as an elective. So we have seen maybe some of the skills that neuroscience students need to excel in this field. But then we have to ask, well, what do students actually believe about these skill sets? And so I'm going to focus in on programming here because there's a lot of really interesting research and thought about how students think about computer science and about programming actually as a skill set. So when we think about bringing coding into neuroscience classes, there's a few things we have to think about. The first thing here is biology instructor knowledge of coding. So I'm a neurobiology faculty. I had to learn on the job as a grad student how to code. I was basically handed a bunch of code and then, told, edit this for your purposes. And my story is like a lot of other biologists and neuroscientists who basically have had to learn on the job. And so most of us who learned that way don't feel capable of teaching other people how to code, right? We don't think of ourselves as computer scientists. And so in the survey that I ran, I actually asked people a few questions related to this. I said, okay, have you ever taken a coding class? I've never taken a coding class. And about a third of people had, at least at some stage. So not too bad. But then if you ask people how comfortable they are with coding, very few people will tell you they're really comfortable. So about a third of people are in this comfortable or extremely comfortable category. So that means that out of all of our biology faculty, for example, um, only about a third of them might feel comfortable teaching those skills to other people. And that's probably not enough faculty really to meet the need. So that's one barrier that we have in terms of bringing coding into neuroscience classes. Another thing we have to think about is the fact that neuroscience students need to learn how to work with data. They need to learn maybe how to visualize that data, work with big data sets like I talked about earlier, but they don't need to know all of the things that like a typical computer science student might need to know. So there are these unknown needs of what I might call like applied or contextualized computing classes versus basic programming classes, like more historical programming classes. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we have to think really carefully about what students think about coding, because this is not like a thing where students don't have any perceptions about it. They have a lot of preconceived notions about what it means to be a programmer. And there's a ton of research on this from a variety of different angles. But essentially, if we kind of break it down, this is from one study, students have the stereotype that people that do computer science are singularly focused, that they're asocial, that they're competitive, and that they're male. So, it's kind of the like typical like tech bro sort of idea in their head, right? And there's a lot of research on the fact that female and minoritized students are even more likely to hold these ideas. So if we're going to invite everybody in, we have to think really carefully about this. So with that sort of in mind, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing at UCSD to try to address these things and to try to create opportunities to learn coding and to become a neuroscientist. So let's start with learning coding. So there's a few different ways we can think about integrating programming into biology curriculum. And I'll put them here on an axis of less independent coding for the student and also lower instructor proficiency. So that's on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, thinking about, okay, maybe students are doing more independent coding, but it might require higher instructor proficiency. So on the left-hand side here, we can say, let's just expose students to coding. Like even just say, look, this is the kind of thing that you might need programming for. Like point to a figure in a paper and say, this was generated, using some sort of code. So this is nice because it doesn't mean students necessarily have to write their own code, but maybe they just start to see the utility and actually get some motivation to learn how to code. In the middle, we can think about integrating this a little bit more into coursework. So in this case, maybe we spend 1 or 2 hours doing introductory programming lessons with our students. So students edit code and they begin to write their own, and there's some really nice published lesson plans. And I'll come back to one in a few moments too. And then finally, we can think about developing a whole course. We could actually take what is a traditional computer science class and place it in the context of biology or neuroscience so that students can really start to write and design their own code. These kinds of contextualized coding classes have been really successful in other places. So when I was thinking about developing this kind of class at UC San Diego, I was inspired by this model at Harvey Mudd College, where since 2009, they've been offering these different flavors of Computer Science 1 or CS1. And so the green bars here show you actually how many female students are in the class. And you can see that many more female students enroll in CS1B. There's also a greater persistence into computer science majors for folks that were enrolled in that biology flavored class. And those students do just as well in subsequent classes. So the fact that it's sort of flavored like biology actually doesn't change anything about how much students are learning. So I was inspired by this, developed a similar class at UC San Diego. So we call it Introduction to Python for Biologists. And the learning objectives of this class are similar to a CS1, but there's a lot of emphasis on things that biologists need to know how to do, like work with data and implement different algorithms for analyzing that data. Since then, this has become a big focus of research for me. So we've run a few studies, and I'll briefly just comment on a couple of those here. This was led by a PhD student, Austin, and we asked a few things. Like first and foremost, when I started teaching this, I was like, who was taking my class, and why are they taking my class? Right? Do they know if coding is important to biology, or did they just enroll in this like on a whim or something? So that was our first question. And I wanted to know if there were, first of all, more female students and also more underrepresented students in my class. So we looked at this in a couple of different ways. On the left-hand side here, this is the percent of degree recipients that are either female or URM. And this is across biology, computer science, and data science. And so this is the backdrop of my university, right? So if you look at the number of female students in biology is about twice as much as in computer science or data science. Same thing for URM students. And that's reflected in the percent enrolled in each of these majors too. So there's about twice as many women, for example, enrolled in life sciences than computer science. So then my question was, okay, like who's in my class? Is the demographic breakdown of my class similar to biology, or is it more similar to computer science and data science? And the thing that we saw that was really amazing to see is that it was almost as high as biology, which means that we are immediately reaching students that we wouldn't normally reach in computer science and data science. And so when I think about giving students access to these skills, this is a really, really good sign, and I'm really happy about that. We also asked, students are enrolling, what helps them stay, right? What helps them decide, even when they get their first error, inevitably from some programming task, how are they going to actually persist past that error? So a couple things popped out to us. First and foremost, students told us in interviews that the fact that there was this application to biology meant that the course was accessible. So people called out even just the title of the class, like, oh, it's Intro to Python for Biologists. So that's really welcoming. People have talked about talked about the fact that I made errors in front of them a lot. Like I said, I've never taken a computer science class, so I make errors, sometimes intentionally, oftentimes not. So, one student said, watching the professor mess up in class, like that's okay, and I feel like I can troubleshoot now. And then finally, they said visualization was rewarding. Like they really liked the fact that this could be kind of a creative endeavor that, unlike a lot of their other biology classes where they were just memorizing information and kind of regurgitating it, that they had a chance to like think creatively, generate plots, and that they could actually take that as a skill into their other classes as well. So finally, something that came up as we were teaching this class was this sort of tension between access and students' perception of the authenticity of the class. So, for example, there was that quote I showed you earlier about accessibility, and that's really nice. But then on the other hand, students said like, well, this I thought there'd be more emphasis on the coding. Like this seems to be all about data. And another student said, well, we code in these things called Jupyter notebooks, which is one platform for coding. And students said, well, this feels like separate from coding. But the reality is actually a lot of professionals and scientists use Jupyter notebooks very professionally, but it just doesn't feel like hacking into the mainframe like students sort of expect coding to feel. So this is really changing the way that we're thinking about it too, which is we need to actually convince students that the kind of programming that we're doing is very real. And so that they will take that with them and start thinking of themselves actually as people with these skill sets. So, what this might mean for you as an educator is that you might consider demonstrating or integrating programming into your classes, um, even just by sort of planting this idea that biologists do things using code. Like, whenever we're talking about genomics or any kind of omics or bioinformatics, that's all using code. A lot of times when we talk about more like how neurons work or how circuits of neurons work, we can say, yeah, we can analyze that data using code. So I think even just sprinkling in those examples can be really powerful. And then finally, I would encourage you, if you've never tried and you've always been kind of curious, maybe try a little bit of programming yourself. I'll talk about some open access resources at the end. But I think this is a powerful thing. And if you build a little bit of comfort in this, you can actually start to show this to your students as well. So finally, encourage your students to give programming a shot. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the neuroscience coursework that I'm developing at UCSD, and then some of the things related to that. So one of the big things I do at UCSD is I teach a lab class. So this lab class goes through a lot of different parts of neuroscience. We do things like recording from single cells, as you can see on the right-hand side here. This is actually a ganglion from a leech, which turns out to be a nice model for poking single neurons. And these students here have filled a single neuron. You can see it bright red in the middle of the screen with dye, so we can actually see the structure of that neuron. This is something I do with 40 or so undergraduates every quarter, which is super fun. During the pandemic, we had to think really carefully about actually how to do this at home. So when I taught during the pandemic, we sent these little recording kits made by this place called Backyard Brains, as well as cockroaches, home with students so that they could do these experiments from their house. They could opt out. So we didn't force this on anybody. You can see though that this was really, really fun. If not for them, but definitely for me. I'm just like cracking up on Zoom as we're doing this experiment. So they would actually be able to record action potentials from the leg. I wanted to mention this today because this company makes a ton of very cool low-cost tools for neuroscience if you haven't heard of them. It's not all cockroaches. You can, for example, get an EEG setup where you're recording from your own brain. You can get one that records from your muscles. So lots of really, really cool activities, just in case you haven't heard of them yet. Finally, and probably not surprising given everything I just told you, I'm also trying to teach neuroscience students how to code. So we do this in a couple of different ways. In my neuroscience classes, we have students work with open data sets. So this is a lesson plan where students are actually pulling data from the Allen Institute, which is a big research institute up in Seattle that shares their data and shares a lot of code to work with their data. And a few years ago, I piloted this lesson plan with students, and I asked people, what do you like most about these computer labs? And then I asked them, what do you like least? And something that I love about this plot on the right is that one of the things they liked least is I didn't have to write much code. So I was like, okay, like you want to do more? Great, let's go. So finally, something I wanted to mention too, as another amazing resource is the Allen Institute has not only open data sets that neuroscience researchers use, but they also have some amazing educational lesson plans. This is one that I think is really, really great, definitely for high school students, maybe even middle school students. But this is about Alzheimer's disease. It goes into how we understand the transcriptome and do immunolabeling of cells. Students can actually look at brains with and without Alzheimer's disease. So it's a very, very cool lesson plan. I'm happy to like put the link in the chat later if someone wants to find it. But if you Google like Allen Institute Alzheimer's disease lesson, I think you'll find it. So in addition, I teach a neural data science course. So a lot of data is open now, and we can actually have students do full-blown research projects with open neuroscience data. So it's kind of an amazing time for that. So this has been a really fun course for students to really actually start doing their own experiments, even if they're not working in a research lab. These days, if you know a little bit of data science and you kind of know a little bit about neural data, you can essentially dig in for yourself and even like answer your own questions, which is really, really cool. So finally, just a few kind of concluding thoughts on what this might mean for high school students. So neuroscience research can take a lot of different forms. So if students are thinking about going into research, there's any number of things they really could be potentially doing, right? We saw C. elegans earlier. I told you that mice and animal research are a part of it. But then they could also do computational research, never touch a mouse or any sort of animal. They could be using microscopes or electrodes. On the right-hand side, this is me in grad school doing what's called two-photon calcium imaging. So kind of like scanning around the brain, watching cells respond to things. So neuroscience research is definitely not just one singular sort of thing. But I think there's a few things we can think about in terms of like preparing for a career in neuroscience. So the first thing is to try to get some research experience and some sort of internships when students go to college. There's opportunities at community college level as well as at universities to get this kind of experience. When I was on Long Island for my postdoc, there were even like high school students, and that happens here too in San Diego, like high school students trying to get research experience. That's great. My thought immediately was like, please, like just enjoy your life before you get to college. Um, of course, there are people that get research experience in high school, but wow, that just feels like so early to me. That's why I said in college here, they're going to be fine if they start in college. Um, Learning how to code is a really great skill, at least being open to it. So you might be like, okay, how do we do that? Let me show you a few things. So you can start to learn some coding skills and put them to test online. So if you don't have access to, like community college classes or our affiliation with a university like near you, you actually can take, for example, one full online programming class called CS50. That's at Harvard. There's also a couple different places like Data Quest where you can go online and for free actually go pretty far in their different like data science tracks that they have. So there's lots of cool opportunities to learn how to code online. Taking that a step further, if you know how to code a little bit, or your students know how to code, you can take an online class in data analysis or modeling. Something that is really great in neuroscience is something called NeuroMatch, and they run free online courses over the summer, but then all of their materials are actually fully online as well. But again, their courses are kind of pitched at a slightly higher level, assuming folks already know how to code and probably know a little bit of statistics too. And then finally, if you have students or you yourself are really ambitious, you can even, as I said, dig into some open data. And there's lots of opportunities for that as well. And happy to like drop some links or just chat more about that too. So finally, as I mentioned in the data, I think, having students gain some collaboration sort of opportunities, some abilities to lead, this is all really, really good because, like I said, neuroscientists aren't just like solely working in labs by themselves. They're working on teams, they're communicating with other scientists. This is a really key piece of what we do as scientists. And then finally, know that there's many paths forward. So neuroscience is not just one thing. And so there's a lot of different possibilities and career combinations that don't even exist today. Like even my current job as a teaching professor, I didn't know about this as a high school student for sure. Don't think I knew about it as an undergrad. And I really only found out about it until maybe even like after grad school. So I think that it's important to know we're sort of in a lot of ways preparing students for a future that we're not even quite sure what it's going to look like, but probably jobs that don't even exist today. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. There's a lot of people who helped with the work, including all the research interns at UCSD, my PhD student, Austin. The Allen Institute has been a really cool collaborator and again, shares a ton of data. And the Cobley Foundation funded some of this work as well. So I'll pause there. Thanks so much for having me, and I would love to hear your questions.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion on some of the barriers that we need to overcome in inspiring our next generation of scientists. So thank you. We did have some questions come in, so I don't have to start this time. I'm excited about that. We'll start with the one that came in the chat. It says, "Do you have any recommendations for coding for high schoolers who have not done it before? I think Python, but where do we start?"
Yeah, that's a good question. People are always like, what language do I start with? And I think that it's a really good question. I do really like Python. So when I think about, you know, the sort of like decisions around which language to use, I think about what is the cost, right? So Python is open access and free. So is R, which is another really popular programming language in biology. But things like MATLAB cost money. So that's like basically a no-go for me. So I'm like, why? And also companies don't really use it because it costs money. So yeah, I really like Python or R. In terms of where to start, I would say, I'll put one thing in the chat. So I mentioned Data Quest. This is a free online resource. You can enroll for free. Basically, you can take a lot of lessons for free, and then at some point they say, okay, now we're going to charge you. But you can go through like a whole intro Python path on their website, which is really great. And the other thing that I mentioned, I'll put the link to this is called CS50, and that's at Harvard, and it's not exactly like what I would teach biology students, but it is a really nice introduction to computer science, kind of more broadly. But kind of amazing because obviously, the folks that teach us at Harvard are some of like the biggest names sort of in computer science, and so really, really cool that they've made this like totally open, which is great.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing those links too. I will be sure to send them out with the recording for everyone just so that you all have them as well. Um, we'll go to our question in the Q&A. It says, "Hi, I am a high school student hoping to do neuroscience research. I was able to find mentors at a biostatistics department at a university, but I am unsure of what research I can do. Do you have any ideas for research that combines neuroscience and computational methods to study the brain?"
Oh my goodness. Well, that's amazing. I mean, first of all, just good for you that you're here, that you're thinking about this. That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's possible to dig into some of this stuff on your own. I love that you have some mentor to kind of help you guide, maybe guide your like questions. Um, yeah, I mean, you might be a really great candidate for something like Neuromatch. So let me put the link for that in there too. Um, Neuromatch, because their stuff is all online. You can dig in, and they have like a whole online with videos and very interactive, basically course you can go through. Um, I think the hardest thing, if you're a high school student, is just knowing kind of what the possibilities are and what the interesting questions might be with the kinds of data maybe that you're finding. And maybe this is something you can brainstorm with your mentor. Like you might say, oh, I found this data set. It seems to have X, Y, and Z. Like, what could we do with it? Like, what kinds of questions could we answer with it? Alternatively, you might start with a research question. Like you might say, I'm really interested in Alzheimer's, for example. Like, what kinds of data would I need to try to study Alzheimer's? So yeah, I think that's awesome. And yeah, good luck. I'll
Thank
say
you.
too, I'm writing another book right now that is tentatively titled Neuroscience in the Age of Data Science. So it's a little bit about sort of exactly this question of like, how do we start to do neuroscience on our own when we have access to data and we can write code to analyze those data. So yeah, when that comes out, it'll be maybe next year or so, but it'll be a little while. So you'll probably already be like publishing papers at this point. But but in case that's useful to you, I guess keep an eye out for that.
That's very exciting. Thanks for sharing with us. So you kind of talked a little bit about how neuroscience is becoming more interdisciplinary. Do you have any thoughts on how that can be reflected in how STEM is taught at the high school level?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, in general, I think I'm a fan of just breaking down disciplinary boundaries, right? I mean, I recognize fully that a lot of classes, like, biology classes are often like intended to teach for the next biology class in the sequence or something. So, obviously there's like biology content that needs to be covered or chemistry content that needs to be covered, right? But I think, ultimately these boundaries are arbitrary, right? Because what about biochemistry? So I think even just like exposing students to the idea that these sort of boundaries between disciplines are just constructed, right? The world doesn't exist in disciplines. I think even just telling students that and showing a few examples of these like interdisciplinary intersections can be really powerful. Because then you're also encouraging students to sort of take what they've learned maybe in biology and apply it to chemistry and not treat it like these are separate things. And as neuroscientists, we have to do that all the time because if we're thinking about cells, okay, we have to think about their membranes, but also there's like physical things like electricity that's happening in those cells. So then we have to start thinking about that too. And we have to combine these ideas in order to make any sense of what the brain is doing. So I would say, yeah, talk to students about interdisciplinary intersections for sure.
No, thank you. And I love that you even threw in there that, sometimes I think teachers find it hard to incorporate different things that aren't right onto the curriculum because I feel like they already feel like they're in such a time crunch already. And they're like,
Yeah.
how do I incorporate these other things that I would love to with no time? So thank
No,
you.
yeah. And I mean, I think it's like, well, maybe there's something where you can just loop in a little bit of something else, right? Or I don't know, talk to the chemistry teacher down the hall and like sort of swap a lesson plan just to like, encourage the sort of like blend of the two. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Another question is, should high schoolers learn data science in addition to coding and neuroscience?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when I think about what data science is, I think of it usually as this sort of intersection of statistics and programming and some like disciplinary content. So, for example, neuroscience or biology. And that's kind of where data science lives. It's like not only do you know how to program and do statistics, but also you have some insight into some um, discipline where you know how to ask questions in that discipline. So, I think to answer your question, like if you're learning neuroscience and you're learning coding, and maybe if you're learning a little bit of statistics, you are sort of learning data science, right? You're at least learning the building blocks of data science. Um, so maybe that's how I would think about it. So maybe the only piece of the equation here is just adding in a little bit more math and statistics to that. And then you'll essentially have kind of a data science package. And then maybe when you get to college, you can take what might be actually called like a data science class where you get to put all of those different skills and those building blocks to the test. So maybe that's one way to think about it. But yeah, I think of data science as the integration of these things that's going to happen like probably after high school. But getting the building blocks early on is really good.
Thank you. So You talked about it a little bit already, but are there any key neuroscience concepts or experiments that you can think of that you think would be best in sparking curiosity in, I won't say younger students, but high school age students?
A couple like common stories people tell, like for example, many of you have maybe heard the story of Phineas Gage, who was this like railroad worker who this is like the early 1900s, and he was like tamping down a rod for the railroad, and like the spike went through his brain, and he survived. But he kind of changed his personality a little bit. Like he became a little more impulsive, and people were like, "Yeah, he's not really Phineas anymore." um, that's kind of like a really like classic cool story that's real, and the doctor who treated this guy wrote a paper about it, and so we have like all the original documentation. You can even go see his skull. I think it's on Harvard Medical Campus. Yeah, so that's kind of cool. It's not really like an experiment, but it is like a fascinating case of like, okay, like how do we know what the different areas of the brain are and what they do? And that was one of the first, I guess, sort of like case studies to show that maybe your frontal cortex, where the spike went through, is important for your sort of personality and maybe your decision making and things like that. I guess the one author or book I would recommend, and there's a million different kind of really cool, interesting case studies in it, is basically anything by Oliver Sacks. I'll put his name in the chat. He wrote a few different things. So he wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is a little bit about like memory and some like visual perception stuff. He wrote Musicophilia, which is about music and auditory perception. So kind of depends a little bit on like what you want to talk about with your students. I guess the other big thing that comes to mind is like um, the studies of patient HM, which are some of the early studies that showed us the role of the hippocampus in memory. And so a lot of people teach about those studies because this one patient had damage to this part of the brain, and then he stopped having particular kinds of memories, not all kinds of memories, but only particular kinds. And that told us a little bit about how the brain processes different kinds of memories differently. So that's another great sort of set of studies too.
Thank you. No, those are all great. I think they all give a good segue of how teachers can introduce something and really get students interested. We had a few questions come in, so we'll
Ooh.
start with, out of curiosity, if a high school were to teach a class on biostatistics, should the material be covered in a quarter, semester, or full year course?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we have biostatistics classes, at our university that are a quarter long, but I guess if I'm thinking about this class being taught every day, but also at a high school, level or high school pace. I mean, I certainly think you could do really interesting stuff in a quarter. Um, yeah, I don't see why not. Yeah, I mean, a full year seems like a lot. Like I don't remember. Oh gosh. I'm like, were things always full year? Yeah, I mean, I think you could do enough in a quarter related to that, without taking away, from some of the real like bread and butter stuff that you also need to do in high school. I don't know. That would be my feeling.
Perfect. No, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to, hi, I'm a high school statistics teacher. This meeting today has been a great opportunity for me. I want to ask if there are some possible data sets where I can use to incorporate to some of the units from my AP Stat class. It is also amazing to see that learning coding can become a great opportunity for students since the skill is crucial in multiple fields. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So for AP statistics, so if you end up teaching like two sample hypothesis testing or something, I would say there's a lot of different data for that. I'll share some of the work that I have on using like the Allen Institute data, because there's at least one piece of this where students, for example, choose two different cell types, and then they ask Are those cell types the same or different in different ways? For example, looking at cells from humans versus mice, asking, are mice a good model organism or not? And so that's maybe like one idea. Gosh, I think it would help to know more about like what. So that's kind of two sample hypothesis testing. It'd be helpful to know what exactly like you would want to incorporate data into. Like, what are the skills that you want students to gain, or is there a particular like kind of statistics concept you want them to kind of play with? I can dig up a thing around correlation too, in case that's useful. Yeah, I'll put a couple things in the chat here.
No, perfect. Thank you. And if it's too much on the spot, you can always email this stuff to me later and I can send it out when I send out the recording too. Just so
Okay.
you know, there's an option there too. We'll squeeze in one more, and then if anyone does have any additional questions, like I said, I'd be happy to forward them to our speaker and we can get you an answer. Um, oh well, we did reply to that really quickly. The hypothesis testing is a great start. Thank you. So
Oh.
we'll go with, in what direction is neuroscience research heading in? Is it more focused on individual neuron function?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's moving quite a bit away from individual neurons. We used to think about, like in the example in the very beginning, we used to think about what single neurons do in terms of, for example, noticing things in our visual world, like responding to stuff that's green or shapes that are round or whatever it might be. But these days, neuroscientists are thinking a lot about actually how groups of neurons work together. And now that we have the ability to measure the activity of those groups of neurons simultaneously, now we can ask questions about, what are groups of neurons actually doing and how do they store information? And sometimes that turns out to be probably closer to what the brain is doing. Like, for example, in the part of your cortex on the outside of your brain that helps you move your limbs, it's really not as simple as something like one neuron signals you moving your arm right or you moving your arm left. It's actually probably something more like there are groups of neurons that work together, and that activity actually decides or dictates or when you move your arm left or right. So, yeah, if anything, I think it's moving away from single neurons and more into what we would call like population dynamics or how those groups of neurons are all working together.
Thank you. I said this last time, but we were going to squeeze in one more quick one. It is, how much time do you spend coding versus your other responsibilities? How much time typically will future scientists devote to coding versus their other tasks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually really like coding when I get time to do it. Like I like, I would say the task of being like, okay, I have some data and I want to, generate some figures or run some statistics on it. And, that's like a fun task to sit down and do. Normally like during the school year while I'm teaching, I don't get a ton of time for that because most of my time, like 70 or 80% of my time, is spent like in class, with students on campus. But over the summer, I do a little bit more of that. So, maybe I'll spend a few hours a week programming or something. But I should say, like people who are more on the research side of things, like I'm a little bit more on the teaching side. Folks that are on the research side of things might spend a little bit more time. Certainly, when I was a graduate student and a postdoc, I would say I spent like at least half of my time programming, like a really good chunk. And like I said, in grad school, just learning how to code actually. So, yeah, so I think it's kind of much more when you're really in the research. It becomes less and less like once you become a professor, because a lot of times it's other people doing the programming for you. They're writing the code. So, now the students that work with me are the ones mostly writing the code, and I usually like review it to make sure that everything looks okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today and all the answers. Thank you to everyone in the audience for engaging in the Q&A. It was great. And I will go ahead and get us wrapped up really quick. So I would like to thank CEE sponsors for supporting us and making these cost-free webinars possible for you all. Thank you so much. They're on the screen. And last but not least, I would also like to thank you all in the audience today for attending the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it.